In part 2 of our lecture on the autonomic nervous system, we will begin our discussion of the pathways taken by the sympathetic nerves to get to their targets. The preganglionic neuron cell bodies in the sympathetic nervous system are located in the lateral horn from T1 to L2 or L3. If the target organ is located in the head, chest, or upper extremities, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons will be in the upper thoracic levels of the spinal cord. If the target is abdominal or pelvic viscera, then the cell bodies will be located in the mid to low thoracic levels of the spinal cord. And if the target is somewhere within the lower extremity, or in the pelvic viscera, or on the lower portions of the trunk wall, then the cell bodies will be located in the lumbar region. Postganglionic cell bodies are located in either ganglia that are alongside the vertebral column, known as paravertebral ganglia, or ganglia that lie just anterior to the abdominal aorta, known as prevertebral ganglia. The paravertebral ganglia are linked together by axons of the preganglionic neurons. These form a chain of ganglia, and the chains of ganglia are known as the sympathetic trunk. So you have one sympathetic trunk on each side of your vertebral column. They are located along the body of the vertebrae, so they're along the anterolateral aspect of the vertebral column. Even though our preganglionic neuron cell bodies are limited to the spinal cord at T1 to L2 or L3, the sympathetic trunks run from the cervical region all the way down to the sacral region. The uppermost ganglion within each sympathetic trunk is known as the superior cervical ganglion. And in most individuals, the lowest cervical ganglion and the uppermost thoracic ganglion fuse together and form what is called a stellate ganglion. You may have heard the term stellate block if somebody has had chronic pain, particularly in conditions such as chronic regional pain syndrome. They will sometimes go in and inject this ganglion in order to stop the sympathetic nerves from causing too much vasoconstriction in the limbs. Here we see a picture of a typical vertebra with the spinal cord in the vertebral canal. We see the structures we are already familiar with: a dorsal root with a dorsal root ganglion, a ventral root, the joining of the two roots in the spinal nerve, and then the dividing off of the dorsal and ventral ramus. But I want you to pay attention now to a new structure. If we look on the sides of the vertebral body, you see what's labeled here as a ganglion of the sympathetic trunk. This would be a paravertebral ganglion. Para meaning next to, so it's next to the vertebra. And here we can see where they've done a plasticization, and we can see the sympathetic trunk in yellow. We have the large aorta in red, so that would be our thoracic or descending aorta. We have some veins in the blue color. Most of the inferior vena cava has been cut away here. But in the yellow, we can see the sympathetic trunk. And you can see kind of how almost at the level of each rib, there's an enlargement. Each of those enlargements is a paravertebral ganglion. The preganglionic neurons are myelinated. Because they have a coating on them that helps act as an insulator that is made up of fatty material, this material has a whitish appearance and makes these neurons look white. The postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated, so they look more gray. As a result, you're going to see as we go through our pathways that we're going to be taking a couple of short bridges. One bridge is known as the white ramus communicans because it is carrying the preganglionic neurons, so it looks more white. The other is known as the gray ramus communicans because it carries the postganglionic neurons and looks more gray. We have short preganglionic axons relative to the length of our postganglionic axons in the sympathetic nervous system because the sympathetic trunk is right next to the vertebral column. From the sympathetic trunk, our postganglionic neurons have to travel the long distance to get to their target. Sometimes that distance is all the way down to a blood vessel or a sweat gland on your foot. So the postganglionic neurons can be very long. We also tend to have a large ratio of one preganglionic neuron for every 20 postganglionic neurons. So when you activate that one preganglionic neuron, we can get a much more diffuse effect than in the parasympathetic system. We're going to start with a general pathway that is used by all sympathetic preganglionic neurons. So again, the preganglionic cell bodies are in the lateral horn of the spinal cord between the first thoracic and the second or third lumbar levels. The preganglionic axon exit the spinal cord via the ventral root. They then follow the ventral root to the spinal nerve, to the ventral ramus, but then immediately leave the ventral ramus and enter the sympathetic trunk through the white ramus communicans. They're now inside the sympathetic trunk. This pathway is followed by all sympathetic preganglionic neurons, regardless of the target. It is once they get into the trunk, however, that we're going to have specific pathways taken. We'll now draw out the pathway taken by all of our preganglionic sympathetic neurons, regardless of where they eventually need to go. So again, we are in somewhere within the spinal cord between the first thoracic and the second or third lumbar levels. The preganglionic neuron cell body is in the lateral horn. The axon is going to travel out of the spinal cord through the ventral root, into the spinal nerve, into the ventral ramus. It's then going to leave the ventral ramus to enter the sympathetic trunk through the white ramus communicans. And our sympathetic trunk, you can see, is this chain of paravertebral ganglia that are connected together. We'll now go through the specific pathways for various targets. Keep in mind that for targets that are located above the respiratory diaphragm, so the heart, the respiratory system, blood vessels and sweat glands and other smooth muscle in the upper extremities or the face region will all have their preganglionic neuron cell bodies in the lateral horns of the upper thoracic levels of the spinal cord. So since we are going to the face in our first pathway, we are going to be starting there in our lateral horns, upper thoracic levels. The axons are going to exit the spinal cord through the ventral root, enter the spinal nerve to the ventral ramus, and then leave the ventral ramus to enter the sympathetic trunk via the white ramus communicans. These preganglionic neurons are then going to ascend within the sympathetic trunk to get to that superior cervical paravertebral ganglion, the highest ganglion in the chain. Here they will synapse with the postganglionic neuron. And the postganglionic neuron is going to leave the sympathetic trunk to follow the common carotid artery and its branches up to the target organs in the face region. Let's now draw out your pathway for the sympathetic neurons to get up to the face region. We have the starting point being the lateral horn of the upper thoracic spinal cord. So there's our preganglionic neuron cell body. The axon travels out the ventral root to the spinal nerve, to the ventral ramus, to the white ramus communicans, where it enters the sympathetic trunk and ascends within the trunk to get up to the superior cervical paravertebral ganglion. Synapses here on the postganglionic neuron, whose axon leaves the sympathetic trunk and follows branches of our common carotid artery up to the smooth muscle of the face. Our next target is the heart. The preganglionic neuron cell bodies again will be located in the upper thoracic lateral horns. The preganglionic axons will leave through the ventral root, enter the spinal nerve, go to the ventral ramus, and then leave the ventral ramus to enter the sympathetic trunk via the white ramus communicans. Once in the sympathetic trunk, most of these axons are going to ascend to the various cervical paravertebral ganglia. They'll synapse in one of these ganglia with the postganglionic neuron, whose axons will leave the sympathetic trunk and travel to the heart through the cardiac nerves. The cardiac nerves are part of a complex of nerves known as the cardiopulmonary splanchnic nerves. At the heart itself, the sympathetic cardiac nerves are going to join together with the parasympathetic branches of cranial nerve 10 vagus nerve to form what is known as the cardiac plexus. This is right under the arch of the aorta. And from here, our sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of these nerves are going to innervate the heart, including its electrical conduction system. Looking at our sympathetic pathway, we're going to be starting in our lateral horns of the upper thoracic spinal cord, going to the ventral root, to the spinal nerve, to the ventral ramus, to the white ramus communicans, into the sympathetic trunk, ascending to a cervical paravertebral ganglion, and then traveling in the cardiac nerve to get to the heart. What I'd like you to do is when you draw this picture, make sure to go back to your previous picture and add in all of the additional labels. So label your ventral root, your spinal nerve, your ventral ramus, your white ramus communicans, your sympathetic trunk, and the cervical paravertebral ganglion. Our next pathway is to the respiratory tract. Once again, our preganglionic cell bodies are going to be located in the upper thoracic lateral horns, and we're going to follow our same pathway to get into the sympathetic trunk. We're going to enter the ventral root, to the spinal nerve, to the ventral ramus, to the white ramus communicans, into the sympathetic trunk. Unlike the nerves going to the heart, the majority of those going to the respiratory tract stay in the upper thoracic levels of the sympathetic trunk, synapsing on the postganglionic neuron in an upper thoracic paravertebral ganglion. The postganglionic neurons then leave the sympathetic trunk via the thoracic visceral nerves, the other subpart of the cardiopulmonary splanchnic nerves. The thoracic visceral nerves then carry the postganglionic axons to the respiratory system. Similar to at the heart, they're going to join together with the parasympathetic branches of the vagus nerve to form a pair of pulmonary plexuses. And these are going to be located at the roots of the lungs. The roots of the lungs are where all of the blood vessels enter and exit, and your primary bronchi enter the lungs. So it's kind of where everything is going in and out of the lungs. Let's draw out our pathway for the sympathetic nervous system to get to the lungs. Again, I would like you to add in all of the labels that you had in that initial picture, so that as you are studying, you are consistently seeing and telling yourself each of the structures involved. So we have the upper thoracic spinal cord in our lateral horn, going into the ventral root, to the spinal nerve, to the ventral ramus, to the white ramus communicans, to the sympathetic trunk. Synapses and a paravertebral ganglion at the thoracic level. Postganglionic neuron leaves the sympathetic trunk, traveling in the thoracic visceral nerve to get to the respiratory system. And the last pathway I'd like to cover in part 2 of today's lecture is the pathway to the upper extremity. We're going to start exactly the same, so we'll be in the lateral horns of the upper thoracic levels of the spinal cord. We're going to travel out the spinal cord through the ventral root, into the spinal nerve, into the ventral ramus, into the white ramus communicans to enter the sympathetic trunk. From here, the majority of our preganglionic neurons are going to ascend up to the cervical paravertebral ganglia. In the cervical paravertebral ganglia, they will synapse with postganglionic neurons. The postganglionic neurons are going to leave the sympathetic trunk through the gray ramus communicans. They're going to then enter the spinal nerve and then follow the ventral rami of the spinal nerves to the brachial plexus and the nerves of the brachial plexus. And they will take these nerves to get to the target organ. So the postganglionic sympathetic neurons are traveling in the peripheral nerves along with our voluntary motor neurons and our somatosensory neurons. So they all take the same road to get to the destination. We'll now draw in our pathway for the upper extremity. We start in the lateral horn of the upper thoracic spinal cord. Enter the ventral root to the spinal nerve, to the ventral ramus, to the white ramus communicans, into the sympathetic trunk. Most of these are going to ascend into the cervical levels because you will recall our brachial plexus contains ventral rami of C5 to T1. So there will be some that stay right at the first thoracic level, but most are going to ascend up to the cervical levels. They will synapse in a paravertebral ganglion on the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron is going to leave the sympathetic trunk through a gray ramus communicans, enter the spinal nerve, go to the ventral ramus, and then follow that ventral ramus into the brachial plexus, and then into one of the branches of the brachial plexus that you already are familiar with. The particular branch it's going to follow depends on where it is going. If it is innervating sweat glands or blood vessels of the skin, it will take the same nerve that innervates for sensation in that part of the skin. So for example, if I were going to sweat glands on my palmar aspect of my thumb, I would go in the median nerve. However, if I were going to be innervating sweat glands on my lateral shoulder, I would take the axillary nerve. So by knowing your somatosensory innervation, you also know your sympathetic innervation.